I just want to say a few things about Section 7. I'm going to leave Section 6 to you. Section 6 is about St. Augustine. And I think that Landsberg was an Augustine scholar, expert, I guess, in the thought of St. Augustine. And he uses Section 6 to really illustrate his ideas about loss and the experience of death through the experience of a loved one, which is a very striking part of Augustine's Confessions, which is about losing a friend to death. And I'll leave that to you. I wanted to say some things about Section 7, which are more, philosophical things I can comment on. And it's a very interesting section. One of the things to keep in mind is that Paul Landsberg is a great philosopher and also a Christian. And I think that's a very interesting thing to be, because on the one hand, to be a philosopher is to have a tremendous amount of respect and gratitude for the thought that came from the ancient world, especially Greece, Plato and Aristotle, but also the Roman world and their philosophical contribution, which is basically Stoicism, which is a kind of an outgrowth of a certain strain of Greek philosophy, I would say. And in Section 7, amongst other things, but mostly sort of thinking about the contribution towards the approach to death that was made by the ancient world, especially by Plato. And he has some very interesting things to say, and a very interesting way of distinguishing himself from thinkers like Plato. But he begins Section 7 really picking up on some themes that he has developed in earlier sections. And really part of it, not only is he a philosopher and a Christian and dealing with the philosophical tradition with relation to death and the immortality of the soul, as well as the Christian tradition, he's a modern person. I mean, he's writing in the 1930s, which was quite a long time ago, but certainly the 20th century, you would say, is modern thought. The truth is that modern thought is materialist, in the sense that, modern thought, the typical way that a modern person thinks about the world is basically with the worldview that is established by science, by physics especially, and that is that reality is a material reality. It's a physical reality, and so this makes, of course, problematic any notion of the personal survival of death. That is something that Landsberg has to confront. That's something that everybody, no matter what your ultimate view of your fate as a person is, whether you believe in an Epicurean notion of death as annihilation, or whether you believe, like Landsberg, in the transcendence of the person and the survival of the person through death, you simply have to confront the reality that modern thinking is not congenial to the idea of personal survival. And he acknowledges that, again, to his great credit, I believe, in the beginning of Section 7. He says, in some form, there's a few lines down, in some forms of experience, we feel our personality trammeled, shattered, or stifled by our corporality. That is, again, say the experience of illness. We feel that our personhood, our individuality, can be smothered by our body, what our body is going through. We have that experience, sometimes in pleasure, sometimes in pain. We have that experience of our personality, again, being covered up by our body. And if we extend that to death, the experience of death, he says this. He says, here death appears to us as the destruction of the person itself, that total annihilation that the existentialists talk about, that Epicurus talks about. The person seems to be only the smoke of the vital fires fed by the hard and solid reality of the living body. If at such a moment we visualize the corporeal reality of our life as destroyed, the person must also appear annihilated and dissolved, since now it will apparently lack its own central force. Man in such a state is a prey to an unlimited anguish of death, which is quite different from a vital fear. And the whole spirit of the person is concentrated in this anguish. It is the horror of the person at the prospect of metaphysical abandonment, an abandonment which is already present in an anticipation of the end of corporeal existence. What is he getting at there? I think he's getting at, the notion that, in the modern world, in which what can be studied by science is taken to be real, and the only thing that's real, and something like a person or a spirit is considered either to be an outgrowth of the body or a total superstition, that death is truly intimidating on the most fundamental level. It seems that the body's death is also the death of me as a whole. That is exactly what he's arguing against in this work, that we should not give in to that horror at this metaphysical abandonment of being left behind in this total way by death. He is not the first philosopher to believe in in some form of immortality, and one of the philosophers he talks about at length in this section is Plato, and how could you ignore Plato, really? And his great dialogue, the Phaedo, which is the dialogue that takes place in the hours before the death of Socrates, in which Socrates and his friends discuss the prospects for immortality. And Plato, through Socrates, describes his ideas about, first of all, why he believes that the soul is immortal, and secondly, what the life of the soul will be once it separates and becomes independent of the body. And what's really interesting, I think, in his discussion of Plato here, is how utterly unfulfilling, from his point of view, Plato's conception of immortality is. And again, this is a Christian viewpoint, and this is a Christian looking not only at philosophy but history itself through a Christian lens. What is missing? I mean, Plato has this idea that the mind, the intellect, the soul, separates from the body and lives an independent existence. But what is the soul? What is this thing which is immortal that Plato thinks can't die? And Landsberg's real problem with it is that it's not me. That is, when the Christian hope wells up, and we have this hope for transcending the limits of time and continuing as persons through and after death, what we want to do is survive as me, as you, as I, as the person, the unique individual that I am. After all, that's what the realization of that unique individuality is what let me see death in its true nature, according to Landsberg, which is threat and menace, because it seeks to wipe out my uniqueness. But therefore, what I demand as a human being is not only that part of me continues and is immortal and can't die, let's say, but that I continue as the person that I am. And this is the problem with Plato, is that Plato could not imagine an afterlife that would be an afterlife of the individual person. Plato imagined an afterlife which is an afterlife of pure intellect, let's say, which has a kind of a generic quality, a sort of an apersonal quality. And he says something very interesting to this effect on page 215 in the second paragraph. He starts this way. He says, the ontology of ideas, and that's the Platonic ideas, the forms, the truth that the philosopher can finally know when he separates from his body. The ontology of ideas is still dependent on the ontology of nature. It has not yet reached the full clarity of categories of mind. This is not a criticism of Plato's doctrines, but it is impossible not to perceive the limits of his experience. The philosopher seems to have been acutely aware of this himself. and appears for this reason to have left unsolved the difficulties created by the interpretation of the existence of the world of ideas. His limitations are the limitations of all pre-Christian philosophy in Europe. The person was not yet disclosed, and the sense of death remained hidden. The man was still in process of discovering the spiritual world of philosophic thought. He had become aware of abstract concepts, but he had not yet become aware of himself as persons. So, for Landsberg, Christianity is incredibly important. It reveals who we are, essentially, as unique persons. That is, that the Christian conception of human existence is, for Landsberg, the ultimate one, the true one, because of this notion of the person, the unique individual. And it also reveals not only what personal survival demands, that the afterlife be an afterlife of the person, of the unique individual, which is ultimately a affirmation of Christianity itself, because for Landsberg, the significance of Christ is as the victor over death, the one who makes possible the sustenance of the actual person, the unique individual, through death. I think that there's a lot more in chapter 7. Is it 7? Yes. About his views on, say, the Stoic philosophers and their notion of death, and his rejection of Epicurus, as ignoring the basic problematic of death by not realizing how the annihilation of the person is viewed with horror from the point of view of the person, and things like that. But especially important, I think, is that way that Landsberg separates himself from Plato in his conception of the afterlife as being an afterlife of the individual persisting, the individual in all his personality surviving death.